Good morning. I'm Janet Holbrook from the Center for Clinical Trials and Evidence Synthesis in the Department of Epidemiology at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Um, I'm happy to welcome everyone this morning to our first in a series of seminars that we've conducted for a number of years now. From the Center for Clinical Trials and Evidence Synthesis seminar series. Um, this year, we're starting off with a very special lecture for the academic year because we're having this lecture as a first step in memorializing our founder, Kurt Meinert. And he died earlier this year, just before his 89th birthday anniversary. Um, and I uh, Kurt was my mentor and teacher, and he lives in my head every day, and I am thankful for that. He was a giant in life, standing at 6'6", as well as a giant in clinical trials, and a prolific writer and teacher and researcher, but mostly I would say um, all of those things, but what we remember maybe most is his writing. Um, and I just want to put in a short plug for his blog post, Meinert's Way, which has a ton of information, and Taylor can post that afterwards. And it's on our clinical trials and evidence synthesis um, website. And the reason I want to do that is Kurt was uh, very staunch about sharing information and our work, like manuals and forms and the things that make trials work um, without copyright. But I'm here to introduce Steve Piantadosi, and the prolific writer is, I think, a place that Steve and Kurt intersected throughout life, and I'll come back to that. But first, I want to tell you about Steve Piantadosi, who many of you are familiar with because he was a faculty member here at Johns Hopkins for 20 some years, and a teacher here. And as I just mentioned to him, I he taught one of the best courses I ever took in graduate school, and I went to a lot of graduate schools too. So I'm throwing Berkeley and University of Maryland and a couple different schools in there. Um, anyway, Steve graduated from UNC in for both his undergraduate and his medical degree, and also uh, got his doctorate in biostatistics at the University of Alabama. Um, but he went on to work at NCI, and he's done an incredible amount of work in oncology. And I'm not from an oncology background, but I know is a leader and a pioneer. But I really think of him as a methodologist. Um, and that theme is throughout his career because when he came to Hopkins, yes, he was the founding director of the oncology center that's now the director of biostatistics here, and really grew that program and did a huge amount of work in developmental and translational clinical trials and training the workforce um, of doctors that are out there in oncology. But it was, where I intersected, when many of us have intersected with him, is the methodological contributions. In 2007, he went to UCLA, where he again took on kind of founding a new center and starting a new center for education of future medical scientists, and that was at the Samuel Oschin Cancer Center. And then most recently, he has been at Harvard since 2018 as a professor and biostatistician associated with Brigham and Young. And I just want to come back to his intersection with Kurt. If they wrote so much together, and I can remember their discussions, and I wish I had recorded them but they have this tome of a book. It's a Talmudic tome on clinical trials that was just published last year that has 7 pages of table of contents, which I would just highly recommend. And we've just ordered a couple copies for the center here. And with that, I give you to our lecturer, Steve Piantadosi.
Thank you, Janet. A very kind introduction. And thank you to Dr. Jabs also for the invitation to speak this morning. I wish the circumstance were a little happier, but it's a pleasure and to have your trust to do this, and also to see many colleagues and faces from my recent past. I would like to begin, first of all, by giving my condolences to Jill Meinert and other members of the Meinert family. Uh, your love and support, I know, was very much appreciated, and many of us also depended on you as a loving and facile interface to help Kurt and work with Kurt. So thank you. This talk is obviously a bit like bringing coals to Newcastle, and uh, there are people in the audience who worked with Kurt perhaps longer than I did, and maybe on many occasions more closely. Uh, Barbara, Doug, Jim, Janet, and others. I don't mean to omit anybody, but you all knew him extremely well. And I feel like I will remind you of some things during this next 40 minutes or so, and I hope you'll feel free to speak up if I do. I met Kurt first in about 1988, and some of you had worked with him already for years by that time. One of the things I might be able to do is to bring a little perspective now that I've been away from Hopkins for 15 years, and that might be very helpful. And also, I hope that to the younger people in the audience who didn't have a close relationship with Dr. Meinert, that this talk will encourage you to become familiar with his work and teachings. So if you have comments or stories about Kurt, please stop me and insert them. The most important part of Kurt, obviously, is as a person, as a husband, father, family member, and I can't fully comment on that. I can talk about him as a friend and a colleague, which I will do, but I want to acknowledge that my talk will be somewhat one-dimensional because of Kurt's other more important part of life. So here's the topics I'll touch on, and each of these will be brief. I'll give a brief bio. We'll talk a bit about his very extensive collaborations, extensive teaching and mentorship, his service, writing, and then hope to have some time at the end to discuss some personal notes, which are very important to me. And again, each of these will be fairly brief. Now, one of my favorite sayings of Kurt's was, it takes money to buy whiskey. I'm sure most of you heard him say that, and I use that expression a lot, particularly in dealing with investigators who are overly ambitious or maybe haven't had enough experience to understand that there's certain groundwork, infrastructure, foundations that need to be laid before you can get to the stuff that we're all interested in. And it's a little bit like fishing. You don't just go out and catch fish. You have to put in the effort and the time, and you may come back with less than what you had hoped for. So it takes money to buy whiskey. A brief bio here. Kurt was born Curtis Linnea Minert in 1934 in Sleepy Eye, Minnesota. Actually, he was born on a farm outside Sleepy Eye, Minnesota, so it's a little bit more rural even than the name Sleepy Eye might imply. He grew up on the family farm, and it's a definite fact of his personality that those experiences on the farm and in his early education stayed with him his entire life. They affected his attitudes, his interaction with people, his metaphors. Um, and it was really interesting to see that. I personally had never been in Sleepy Eye, and at one point I began to wonder if it wasn't some sort of mythical place, but no, it was real, and Kurt was definitely the embodiment of that. He received a BA in Psych in 1956 from the University of Minnesota. He was married to Susie Matson, who we came to know as Dudley, on June 22nd, 1957, and 2 years later received his master's in biostatistics from the University of Minnesota, and then ultimately a PhD in biostatistics in 1964. Soon thereafter, he moved to the University of Maryland first as an assistant professor, and then progressed through the ranks and became professor and acting chair of the Department of Epidemiology and Preventive Medicine there. So clearly, they recognized his talent. In 1979, he moved to Hopkins, to the School of Public Health, and was there until the time of his death. And very significantly for those of us in this audience, he was professor and founding director of the Center for Clinical Trials. Kurt was a pioneer throughout all of the appointments and actions of his career. He was a founding member of the Society for Clinical Trials and the founding editor of the original journal for the Society of Clinical Trials, Controlled Clinical Trials. Somewhat later, the journal would transition or switch to clinical trials, but he was the founding editor of the original journal. Kurt and Susie had 3 children, Julie, Nancy, and Jill, 4 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. Now, I've already hinted how versatile Dr. Minert was in his pioneering. And if you look at some of the achievements recognized by his peers, you can see this. He was a fellow of several societies that are perhaps, well, certainly related in terms of Kurt's work, but independent in terms of their approaches to science. The American College of Epidemiology, AAAS, which is a much broader, I guess, wider membership society, the American Heart Association, and the Society for Clinical Trials. He was also honored by Delta Omega, the Public Health Society, and the American Public Health Association. So this points to a very almost spectacular breadth of work and depth as well, because you don't get recognized by these types of societies and these different societies without doing a lot of hard work that is recognized by the members. So this, along with what I mentioned previously with Kurt's founding gene, founding DNA for the society and the journal and the center, indicate his incredible versatility. He was also a visionary, and I think it's very important to remember that much of the work that I'm referring to took place decades ago, and at a time when our field and our science, our methodology was fairly primitive. He foresaw in the 1970s the need for multi-center collaborations and computing, and he put his money where his mouth was. He he began teaching this and writing about it. He was prescient about the governance and organization of clinical trials, recognizing the need for process and governance committee structure that he taught so well in later years. I already mentioned he anticipated the need for the society and the journal to support the field. He was among the early advocates for trial registration and later used those data extensively to better understand the field. He was a pioneer in teaching clinical trials methods and collecting and organizing materials to do so. I can tell you, having been at several institutions, that most places that purport to teach clinical trials actually don't really do that. What they do is cherry pick a curriculum from existing courses, and they take the ones that are closest to clinical trials and struggle really to get experts who are going to organize the discipline in a way that is most helpful for students. Kurt didn't do that. He developed his course and his course materials specifically for clinical trials. And he always saw very clearly flaws in process and methods and firmly advocated for their correction. And this was the case whether you talked to him in private or whether you were with him in a large collaboration and it required the necessity of speaking up and dealing with clinical investigators. Kurt always saw where the cracks might be and tried to prevent or fix them. Now, if you're a younger audience member and you're not familiar with some of these high points I've indicated, please do go to trialsminorway.com. Janet mentioned this in the beginning. It's a wonderful repository of Kurt's wisdom. And I hope that it will be around for a very long time. Many of us consulted and very much need and want the repository of documents and information that's there. There are pearls of wisdom, perspectives, and policies that are matured from his experiences of well over half a century of clinical trials. And his experience is actually more than half, if not three-quarters of one might argue is the actual life or history of the modern clinical trial. If we take the onset date roughly in the 1940s with, say, the Santa Chrysum trial, I mean, Kurt was working, teaching, mentoring during a substantial fraction of the entire modern history of clinical trials. I'm going to shift and talk a little bit about collaborations. And Kurt obviously had many wide collaborations, as I've already hinted. A quote from him would be this question, would you ride the river with them? He didn't want to get involved with people who weren't intellectually brave and had fortitude and quality in their character. And this was his way of asking that question, would you ride the river? If you look at some of the collaborations that he had, these are like his, the highlights I've mentioned from his career, they're also very far-ranging and in depth. In bold here, I've indicated some of the ones that stuck out as I read through his list of collaborations. He was focused on the inclusion of women in clinical studies from the Institute of Medicine, now the National Academy of Medicine at the National Academy of Sciences. He was a member there for a couple of years and those of you who are old enough will remember how important this issue was at the time. Kurt was on the forefront of it. The FIO clinical trials were important in the history of trials for some unfortunate events that occurred. IOM also asked him to reflect on the methodology in response to the FIO trials. You can find in his list of collaborations a variety of diseases from migraine to asthma to eye diseases. And, you know, these pop up in his collaborations, just showing again his versatility and depth. Data and safety monitoring was an important theme in Kurt's work. There were numerous DSMVs that he served on. These are all outward facing national and international collaborations, but Kurt was also inward facing toward the institution. And he worked with us in the Cancer Institute while I was there, serving on the DSMB and helping us to structure that. He worked on numerous collaborations inside public health, mentioned eye diseases, conflict of interest. A lot of his work in eye disease was done at Wilmer. Many of you know that very well. And he also took his experiences and knowledge about DSMB responsibilities and organized them in, as teaching materials. He worked a good bit with the Veterans Administration. He worked with private pharma. There's a few here. Vitamin A, some of you will recognize the importance of that topic historically in public health at Hopkins. Serum cholesterol, and so on. All of these are things that apparently Kurt was willing to ride the river with these investigators. ADHD, somebody could probably tell me a little bit more about chromium picolinate. I'm not sure what that collaboration was, but it seemed a bit unique and jumped out at me. So maybe later somebody will explain that to me. Treatment of alcoholism, mental health, and so on. Now, this is what we're all supposed to be doing as academics, is collaborating widely. But Kurt was really spectacular in his ability to engage these different topics and understand that there were organizational, methodological, safety and related considerations that are common across all of these disciplines, and that when one learns the principles here, that they are immediately applicable in all of these different contexts. Very, very impressive. And these are just selected ones that I personally picked out because I thought they would be interesting to talk about. Most of us also knew Dr. Meinert as a teacher and a mentor. And if you don't know, you can whisper to your colleagues, what does he mean, BTS or POS? Some of you are probably smiling because you know, some of you are puzzled. Ask somebody and they'll tell you. But this was hard-edged talk from Kurt, and he did not hold back. I have a list of advisees, and a number of you are on it. I hope I haven't omitted anyone from the list, but it's really quite extensive, not only in terms of the different topics that people were interested in, but the span of time involved here. It's 30 years or so. Now, that's not so obvious from the list because, interestingly, although a CV is traditionally organized in chronological order, Kurt's list of advisees was in alphabetical order, and I was a little confused about that at first, and then thought about it for a minute. And of course, it made perfect sense and it fit perfectly well with Kurt's practicality. If you're talking about a former student, master's or doctoral or whatever, you care about the who and not so much about the when. And so the organization in alphabetical order made perfect sense. But here they are. There's multiple pages. If you should be on this list and aren't, then you'll have to let somebody in the center know. But as I said, this ranges from the mid 1980s up until 2017, I think was his last student, Jillian Gresham, who is with us today. And I'll say a bit more about that particular mentorship later in my talk. So very impressive. If you look at Kurt's involvement in doctoral exams, pre-doctoral as well as thesis defense, also an extensive list that goes beyond the names that I just said. So really a spectacular history of contributions to the field, to new knowledge, to new investigators who are now all over the country, all over the world. Kurt's textbook on clinical trials was really a high point, and I think one of the first attempts to organize the discipline in a way that people could read and learn and refer to and understand exactly what they should be doing to support complex multi-center investigations. It was used in the course, and we're lucky that Kurt updated this into a second edition. It can be tough reading because it is detailed and extensive. But if you have a question about the organization or conduct of these collaborations, then you can probably find pages, if not an entire chapter, devoted to that topic in this book. And so it's a wonderful resource for us to have. And I think Kurt became very well known for this. There were, at the time, just beginning to be various monographs on clinical trials, and these were usually written for a different audience who wasn't as interested in digging into the meat and potatoes of these collaborations. And Kurt's book was really the first to tackle the subject in a broad and deep fashion. He didn't stop with just writing textbooks. Now, what kind of person writes a dictionary or two dictionaries? And Kurt loved language. He was very particular about how it was used and the definitions of words. This was a labor of love, and I know it took a lot of his time and focus, was constantly talking to people about what words meant and so on. So here are his two dictionaries. I promise you that as a writer, I often consulted these and wanted to be sure that my usage didn't vary too much from what Dr. Meinert mentioned. Occasionally it did, and I would have a discussion with him about whether that definition of that word was, on target or not. He was always receptive to discussing nuance and meaning. I'll say more about dictionaries again in a minute. There are plenty of other books as well. Handbooks of clinical trials, An Insider's Guide to Clinical Trials. These maybe are lesser known unless you worked with Kurt or had him point to one of these based on your questions regarding interactions, collaborations, or structure and governance. These are enormously useful because they're very practical, and they take a lot of his experience and wisdom and put it in a form that anybody can refer to and learn from. So this is an incredible intellectual output and organizing ideas around clinical trials. further evidence of teaching comes from the classroom. I counted 46 topics around design and conduct of clinical trials, which used to be known as 340.61. I don't know, Janet, if it has the same number now. But there were others, guest lectures, 78 guest lectures, other kinds of lectures, 66 invited seminars, 154. I mean, if you add all this up and divide by the 60 years of Kurt's academic career, this is quite an effort every year, month after month, to be able to deliver this kind of wisdom and knowledge to audiences, and just an uncountable number of individuals who benefited from his wisdom. Now, another component of the academic life is service. Kurt's remark here was that we are not a boutique operation. Everybody washes windows. And again, this is the farm boy talking and understanding that this kind of engagement and labor is absolutely necessary in a collaboration. In this picture, which I took on a fishing trip we went on together off the Outer Banks here, it's very typical, I think, of Kurt's contemplation and sort of looking at you through almost closed eyes, and taking your measure in a way and understanding whether you're going to be a window washer or something else. I particularly remember Kurt's involvement in the IRBs. He often took this perspective in discussions around clinical trials. He served in the Joint Committee at the School of Medicine and also the Committee on Human Research and Public Health. I think he was a giant on that committee, and many of the lessons and perspectives that he took from that vantage point of human subjects research, he brought to his work in teaching and clinical trials. Other service venues, conflict of interest, admissions and credentials. I mentioned DSMVs already, faculty senate, A&P committee, various awards selection committees. Again, a huge breadth of service and contributions to the institution and to the field. Editorial service, I mentioned already, the journal, but he was on the editorial boards of other journals and a peer reviewer for many journals, JAMA, Annals, and others. So here again, recognizing the need and the ability to contribute as a clinical trials methodologist to all these different venues and perspectives, hugely important. You know, I want to emphasize that, again, those of us in academic life, we seek to do this, yes, but Kurt did it, you know, longer and deeper and in more variety than many of us could ever hope for, and truly impressive contributions. Kurt was a researcher and a writer about research. I'm going to need a tutorial here from somebody who heard this more than I, but pigs is pigs and data is data. So here's a melding of his life on the farm with his life in academics. And as many times as I heard this, I'm not sure exactly how to translate it, but it always seemed appropriate at the time. The picture is Kurt giving some either pig information or data information to my son, Stephen, who was on this fishing trip I mentioned a while earlier. And I'm very grateful that they had an acquaintance and even a little bit of a relationship. Kurt was able to impart some wisdom to him. Kurt's research spanned, you know, decades, 1961 to 2022. So over 60 years. a career is often stated to be 20 years. A lot of people look to work 20 years and retire. This is 3 careers worth of research by that measure, over 300 publications listed on his CV. We might look at that now, knowing the way authorship works, and say, well, 300 isn't that much. Maybe in 2022, but beginning in the 1960s, to have a career with 300 collaborative publications is truly impressive. And the breadth there, I encourage our young listeners to look through Dr. Meinert's publications. I'm sure you'll find some that are extremely interesting. This one most recent evolution of data and safety monitoring boards should be almost required reading. And I'll mention a couple of others that I particularly like. There's one, for example, called Blind Stupidity, which was a piece in the New England Journal about why we should not be masking data monitoring committees. That was published in 1998. Very influential opinion piece and very wise at the time. And to this day, this is one thing that I learned from Kurt, was not to serve on a completely mass data monitoring committee. He had a 1988 paper on prospective registration trials. There was work from his time on CMV retinitis around 2000. And in the early 2000s, some publications dealing with the National Emphysema Treatment Trial. And Kurt was very influential in the way that we started and ran that trial, and then very much stepped aside and left much of the day-to-day to me and Jim Tanasha and Alice Sternberg. Research grants are another measure of one's research productivity. If you look here from 1981 to 2018, there's 40 years of research support and collaboration mentioned on Kurt's CV, at least 30 such grants. Many of you were principal investigators on these grants, and Kurt was a collaborator, and I'm sure you can attest to the value of having his wisdom in looking over your shoulder, if you will, on those grants. If you look at the scope of the grants that Kurt held over those 38 years or so, there were grants at NHLBI, Heart, Lung, and Blood, if you will, the National Eye Institute, National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, National Institute of Digestive Diseases and Kidneys, NCHSR, National Center for Health Services Research, from pharma and from various foundations. So again, a huge range and assortment of grants and contributions. Here's some more of Kurt's writing. Another 5 books. I have to admit, I personally haven't read these books, but I sort of know their content. I think probably all of these were self-published, but I put them here because they do contain wisdom, and it points to this genetic need of Dr. Meinert's to summarize his experiences and be heard and extract from even very simple things and life experiences, lessons that might be relevant to other people, and particularly in clinical trials. I'm sure these volumes are around somewhere, and you should have a look, and you might be surprised to find an odd title being very important in how you think about the world. So we're at a point where I'd like to offer a few personal notes, and this is very important to me because I did have a long and interesting both professional and personal relationship with Kurt, and I'm very grateful for that. so this is my blah, 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 and so on, the personal notes. This picture, I'm not sure where it came from, but he is wearing the blah, blah, and so on hat. I hope many of you saw him do that at some points. Now, one of the things, and thank you to my wife Bonnie for mentioning the stapling protocol that Kurt circulated to Dean Al Summer in Public Health back in 2004. This was in response to some sloppy stapling that he had received from the office. And this was, pure Kurt to pick up on this and not take himself too seriously, but I guess also make a bit of a point. So he was always willing to use simple circumstances to raise issues and make points. I used to occasionally hear how he had griped about parking rates and on campus and other things like that. He was compelled really to develop these issues into things that one would use instructionally. I'm lucky that Bonnie, who's in this picture here, worked with Kurt for 12 years. I don't know the occasion of that boat. I think that was in Seattle, if I remember correctly. And the other picture was from a trip to Alaska that Michael Davidson had organized. And we all went to the academic presentations there. And then our social event was on the polka train. There was a fairly well-known movie some years ago with John Voight called Runaway Train. And the train track that was used to film that movie was, in fact, the polka train outside of Anchorage. So we took the train out into the countryside and did some cross-country skiing. And then on the way back, there was beer and polka. That's where that picture came from. So this sort of amazing, what's the right word, breadth or heterogeneity in Kurt's ability to engage from the mundane to the more serious everywhere. I learned a lot from Dr. Beinert, and I'm very grateful. Here are some of the things that I learned on a personal level. His attention to detail. I'm not as detail-oriented naturally. That was an important lesson to me. Process of collaborations, the notion that the structure of your collaboration was the way it was going to function, and you couldn't expect to put structure in place and have it behave differently than it was fundamentally designed to do. I've mentioned already the IRB perspectives and the notion of blind stupidity. Kurt was very focused on authorship and being sure that it was just and appropriate. Speaking up in collaborations, finishing. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. And I also learned to get your bets in writing. I'll tell you why that's on the list. One of the things I'm most grateful for is on our fishing trip, one of our two fishing trips, Kurt sat with my dad, who's on the right. They became friends very quickly, often asked about each other. And I was very grateful. They shared some characteristics in common. And I was very grateful for that. We both like some things on this list. Trials, obviously, bullshitting, humor, woodworking, fishing, complaining, and betting. And Kurt and I would often bet. And sometimes, he would win and I would win. Now, I was able to get Kurt angry twice in our history together. Once is when I griped about his handwriting. And the other time is when he won a bet and I was a bit annoyed. It was a nickel bet. That was typical. The nickel bet, I cut the nickel in half before I sent it to him. And he was pretty annoyed with that. He taped it up on his wall for a long time. And if I was in his office and would see it there and remember how annoyed he was, then, I always felt a little sheepish. but I felt at the time like maybe he deserved only half a nickel. This was a bet I won, and um, I think Kurt got back at me a little bit here over this Astros versus Red Sox bet. And this is Kurt's envelope where he sent it to me in Boston. I think he knew I didn't have my primary appointment at Dana-Farber. I did have an affiliation there, but it wasn't where my office was. And you have to look at that handwriting and say, that's not the greatest handwriting. But Kurt insisted that he had a penmanship award as a child or a young person, and even showed me some paper that purported to be a penmanship award. And I really didn't believe it. And here's his handwriting. And I swear he sent this to the wrong address on purpose. It was months coming to me. And when it finally got to me, I think on the third try, I stuck it up on my bulletin board in Boston and sent him a picture. So this is, betting plus humor. We were constantly after each other, if you will, in this way. There were some later projects in the final years of Kurt's life, and I want to mention three of them. And Jillian Gresham, I apologize to you for calling you a project, but you were what'll probably be my last doctoral student, and I think you were the final student that Kurt mentored. You were very successful intellectually, but one of the things that Kurt insisted, there were two things that he wanted to be able to teach Jillian as she finished her doctorate. One was he wanted to see her get angry, and Jillian has such a good nature, and I don't know that he ever was successful in getting you angry. Maybe he was. The other thing he wanted to teach you was to bet, and I think he did succeed in teaching you to bet. Jillian is a pretty shrewd bettor and has won a couple dollars here and there from both me and Kurt. And I hope that's an important skill that you'll use in your career. The other project Janet mentioned in the beginning was this mega work on principles and practice of clinical trials. Now, the story behind this is that I had been looking for several years, many years, in fact, for partners, plural, to work on this book. And I thought that this would do a couple of things. One, it would engage members of our community. It would help to define the field of clinical trials. It would reflect clinical trials as a discipline exactly the way that other foundational disciplines in medicine are recognized, like medicine, surgery, pediatrics, and so on. And it needed to have this title. It needed to be multi-author. It needed to have editors who had some respect in the field. And I failed and failed and failed to find partners until after a considerable discussion with Dr. Meinert, I was able to get him to agree to take on this work. And it took years. We mapped this out over 150 or so chapters, used the resources at Springer to contact people, and just got into it when the pandemic came along, maybe midway through or so. And this became enormously frustrating to me personally, perhaps less so to Kurt, but there were people who promised chapters and didn't deliver. There were timetables that were broken and so on. And as the years went by, and again, thanks to Jillian, who was finishing during this interval, and she was enormous help to us in writing chapters and contributed all of the appendices to this book. It became clear that Kurt had a certain urgency to finish this work. And I was at first puzzled, but he was, teaching us something about finishing and not just starting. And he became insistent enough that at some point we decided that we would take a hatchet to the remaining chapters. There were 20 or 30 or maybe more that had to be eliminated because the authors simply weren't producing them. And so the book actually came out to be smaller than it was intended to be. And I became a little resentful, I guess, to some people who had made assurances. I remember one individual that was a person I had personally contacted and worked with and who promised a chapter. And when I was able to find him after 2 job changes, he said, "Oh, I completely forgot about that. Sorry, I can't do that." And we're now, 3 years overdue. And I was very annoyed by that. But Kurt's attitude was much more constructive, and he was, looking to the finished product and recognizing the need to have this work out in the field. And so we were able to finish it to the same extent that any large work is ever finished, of course. But part of the whole point here was not to finish, to have this be a living reference online. And it does live online. And it's my hope, and I know Kurt shared this, that young people in the field would take this up and revise it and contribute new knowledge, new chapters, and have this be multiple cycles over decades of work that would help to define the field of clinical trials. So time will tell whether that actually happens. The little pig up here was a pig I found on one of my travels. Kurt loved pigs, as you could tell from an earlier setting, and I intended to deliver it personally to him. I didn't get the chance, but I did tell him I had it, and he asked to have a picture of it, which I sent him. So that will be my pig. So I want to say that Kurt was a friend to me. He was a friend to Bonnie. He was a friend to my dad, a friend to my son, a friend to many of you. I'm very grateful for that. I want to say thank you to Dr. Miner for being that wonderful colleague, teacher, friend, mentor, confidant, role model, and for touching all of our lives. Thank you all for your attention.
Well, thank you, Steve. That was a wonderful review, and I think the way that you just made us realize that how enormous his work was, and how productive. Uh, because all that time, when I was starting with him, working very hard on the research, he was writing and teaching and um, just had an enormous capacity for work. And when I said earlier that he lives in my head every day, um, is as a writer when you're trying to communicate things to people. I think of him and I try to pass it on to the people I work with now about when you're writing a ppm, the person needs to know why they're sitting there reading this document. Why is it important to them? And those principles just are live with me every day now.
Who? Yeah, she's right. This is Barbara. I just want to mention one of Kurt's sayings that some of you may never have heard, but it was one of my favorites about being at the coordinating center for a large clinical trial. The saying was, when you're up to your ass in alligators, it's hard to remember you set out to drain the swamp, which I've often thought of in the middle of tumult in the trials I was working on.
That's a metaphor for our times too, Barbara, I think.
I agree.
Yeah, and it's also hard to skate in a buffalo herd.
That was a good one too. Steve, you did a great job.
Thank you, Barbara. I know that you had a long and fond relationship with Kurt. I wonder if you have any other wisdom to give to our audience.
I can't say I have any other wisdom. I did first work with him in 1970, and it continued one way or another until his death. Yeah, he was really a giant in our field.
Well, I will translate though, because I had forgotten about BTS. I don't know how I forgot about it, but Bob Wise recently uh, did a short memorial to Kurt and shared a story. And I don't know if Bob is here this morning. I know he has a doctor's appointment. Uh, and about how he was advised to take this grant over for Kurt to read it before, you know, he would submit it, and it was for I think the lung health study, but I may be mistaken. And so he got it back, and it was all marked up and really just great. You don't know how Kurt could edit and you would think you wrote the best thing, and he'd be like, what is this? You don't need this. A lot of times, it might have been a great expletive of a particular thought, but you don't really need it in your grant or in your paper or whatever. And it said BTS on it, and Bob went to Alice Sternberg to get the translation, and it was actually a high compliment from Kurt, because it meant better than shit. um, and you never wanted to get POS, which I didn't see often, but I think he used POS more in speech than in actual editing.
Hello, this is Nancy Geller. I'm kind of a newcomer as far as being a fan of Kurt goes. Steve, I really enjoyed your talk, and you reminded me of some things I learned from Kurt as one of the people who edited a chapter in a section of the most recent book. The first is how important it is to be versatile in medicine, to apply your clinical trials knowledge no matter what the disease. Second, when you give a clinical trials course, to punctuate it with examples so that everything becomes real to the audience. And the third thing is part of the dictionary, which is to call those who enter clinical trials participants, not subjects and not patients. So I think Kurt had profound influence on many of us, both far and near. And of course, I miss his funny little essays, which used to come every week. Thanks.
Thank you, Nancy. I really appreciate that. It's good to see you.
Hi, Steve.
Tom, your hand's up.
Yeah, my hand is up. And first of all, wonderful talk. I'm going to simply add a correction, and that is, especially if you're going to use the slides again, Minnesota biostatistics was biometry until 1987, when I got there and changed the name for public relations reasons. So his degree was biometry. Not that that changes anything about Kurt, but it may change your slide.
Yeah.
And that I'll simply say, wonderful talk.
Thank you, Tom, for that correction. I'm pretty sure that what I put in that bullet might have been verbatim copied out of this CV, but we'll check and make sure we have it correct. Thank you.
Well, I wish I had noticed it when he was alive so I could tease him about it. But anyway.
Jillian, I saw your hand up. Are you still with us?
Hi, I am. I just wanted to first thank you so much for your lecture this morning, Dr. Piantadosi, and of course for being part of my academic journey and your co-mentorship with Dr. Meinert. He always said I needed both an East Coast and West Coast mentor to get through the program. And I just wanted to express again how grateful I am for all of Dr. Meinert's lessons, both in academia and in life, and for showing me the way as what he would call me, a graduate student. And then just to answer your questions, he did not ever succeed in making me angry, I don't think. But I did receive in the mail, February 2021, a certificate from him with a framed dollar bill and a note indicating that I had graduated from betting school, signed from the betting, my betting mentor. So I did.
Great.
I did.
Well, congratulations on that supplement to your doctorate from Hopkins. I will say, Jillian, you have an awesome responsibility. I think being the youngest Kurt Minor mentored person, and I hope that you will continue to carry on his wisdom and attitudes. So thank you for that remark.
Yeah, I just included some of his teachings in my slides for my first lecture yesterday. So hoping to continue to pass it on.
That's great. Taylor, are we okay taking a couple of other remarks if we run past 9:30? Is that acceptable?
Of course, yes. I